Did Max Verstappen just issue a warning about the new Red Bull car? Because after the first practice sessions in Australia, the world champion himself made a statement that is worrying the paddock. He says that these cars no longer feel like true Formula One. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Do you think Red Bull can really start this new technical era behind Ferrari and Mercedes? Because what's happening in Melbourne could completely change the start of the season. Stay until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In this video, we're going to analyze Max Verstappen's most impactful words after the first practice sessions of the Australian Grand Prix. Statements that don't just talk about the Red Bull's performance. They also directly question the philosophy of the new 2026 regulations. And when a driver like Verstappen speaks like this, the paddock listens. The start of the Australian Grand Prix isn't just another race on the calendar. It marks the beginning of a completely new technical era in Formula One, a profound transformation that changes how cars generate performance and how drivers must construct a competitive lap. New power units, much more aggressive energy management, and a different aerodynamic balance are forcing all teams to reinterpret concepts they had dominated for years. Red Bull arrives at this point in a particularly interesting situation because, for the first time in a long time, it doesn't enter the season as the clear benchmark in the paddock. The main reason is the enormous technological shift involved in the Red Bull Ford project. Until now, the team had worked with established engine structures within the grid, but in this new phase, engine development is starting virtually from scratch within its own program. In preseason testing, the package showed surprisingly solid reliability for such a young project, completing long stints without major issues. However, when analyzing lap times and real race pace simulations, a conclusion is emerging that is already being discussed quite clearly within the team. Ferrari and Mercedes seem to have found a slightly superior initial performance. That internal diagnosis became even more evident in the first real laps on Friday in Melbourne. Ferrari immediately looked strong, with Charles Leclerc setting competitive benchmarks from the very first sessions, while Verstappen remained close, but without imposing the superiority that for years made Red Bull the car to beat. The Dutchman was still fast, precise, and consistent, but the car didn't seem to have that extra margin that in other seasons allowed him to control the weekend from the first practice sessions. The first practice sessions for the Australian Grand Prix offered a fairly clear initial snapshot of the new competitive balance. From the very first minutes on track, Ferrari displayed very solid speed at Albert Park, something that immediately caught the paddock's attention. Charles Leclerc set one of the session's benchmarks with a lap of 1 minute, 21.227 seconds, a time that placed the Italian team at the top of the timesheets. It wasn't just an isolated fast lap. What was most surprising was the car's consistency under varying fuel and tire conditions, something that usually indicates a very well-developed technical foundation for the start of a new regulatory era. Red Bull, meanwhile, appeared competitive but lacked its usual dominance. Verstappen was consistently near the top of the timesheets, demonstrating the car's potential, but he couldn't create the gap that in previous seasons was evident even in practice sessions. In some sectors, the Red Bull looked very stable, especially in fast corners where the downforce seemed to be working correctly. However, in other parts of a circuit, the car showed slight time losses that prevented it from establishing a completely dominant lap. For a driver accustomed to controlling the pace of the weekend from Friday, this detail does not go unnoticed. Another interesting element was the comparison with Mercedes and McLaren. Both teams seemed to be very close to the leading group, suggesting that this new generation of cars could offer a much more compressed grid than in recent seasons. In other words, the gap between the top 4 teams could be significantly reduced. When that happens, every small technical detail takes on enormous importance. Energy management, car balance in mid-corner corners, and aerodynamic efficiency begin to make differences that were previously masked by the overall superiority of a single team. Max Verstappen's comments after the first practice sessions weren't the typical cautious responses from a driver at the start of a race weekend. They were direct, quite critical, and very revealing about how these new 2026 cars really feel. When asked about the car's handling and the new technical regulations, the Dutchman explained that the biggest challenge isn't just finding speed, but understanding a completely different driving philosophy. According to him, the heavy reliance on electric power radically changes how a fast lap is constructed. Verstappen explained that drivers can no longer simply attack each corner as they could in previous generations of Formula One. With these regulations, every decision during a lap affects the battery's energy deployment. Lifting off the throttle slightly in a corner can mean having more electric power available several corners later. Not doing so can cause the hybrid system to run out of energy at the most critical moment of the lap. In other words, performance no longer depends solely on the car's limits or the driver's skill, but on a complex energy strategy that must be executed corner by corner. What was most striking was the tone Verstappen used to describe the situation. He explained that he had already warned in the simulator that this type of regulation could create unnatural driving sensations. He even mentioned that he had previously expressed these concerns, noting that the driving experience could deviate from what Formula One has historically been. Laurent Mekies has publicly acknowledged that the team is not arriving in Australia as the technical benchmark of the grid. He explained that the team's own internal data indicates that Ferrari and Mercedes could have a slight advantage in pure performance at the start of the season, something that has raised eyebrows in the paddock coming from a team that has dominated the recent era of Formula One. The main reason for this caution lies in the enormous technological challenge posed by the new Red Bull Ford engine project. Unlike Ferrari, Mercedes, or even other manufacturers with decades of experience developing hybrid units, Red Bull is experiencing its first full season as an engine constructor. Although pre-season testing showed remarkable reliability, Mekies himself explained that the hybrid system's performance is still in an early stage of development. In such a competitive championship, small details in energy calibration or power delivery can mean several tenths of a second per lap. There is also a clear awareness within the team that the engine's development will be a long and demanding process. Mekies has spoken openly about the challenging months ahead, during which the team will have to experiment with energy maps, hybrid system configurations, and different electric deployment strategies. This means that during the first few races, the primary objective will not be solely to fight for victory, but to gain a deep understanding of how the car's complete package functions under real race conditions. For a team accustomed to dominance, embracing this learning phase requires a very different mindset. Looking at the situation after the first practice sessions, what might happen in the coming sessions depends primarily on one factor that is dominating this new technical era, understanding the hybrid system. In a set of regulations where energy management can completely change the performance of a single lap, the teams that optimize that balance first will have an immediate advantage. Red Bull knows it is still in that learning phase, but it also knows that small adjustments to the electric deployment, power maps, and how the battery is charged during the lap can unlock performance that has yet to be seen on track. Herein lies one of the most interesting potential scenarios of the weekend. Qualifying pace might not tell the whole story. If Red Bull maintains the consistency it showed on long runs during preseason testing, the team could have a very valuable strategic weapon for the race. On a circuit like Albert Park, where tire degradation and pace management play a significant role, a stable car during long stints can compensate for a tenth or two of a second off the fastest lap. For a driver like Verstappen, who knows how to control race pace with enormous precision, that consistency can become an opportunity. Uncertainty. When regulations change so drastically, the first few months of a championship often become a parallel race of development, data analysis, and technical adaptation. Some teams decipher the car's behavior before others, and that process can completely alter the competitive balance in just a few races. In the midst of this scenario, Max Verstappen emerges, a driver who has historically demonstrated an extraordinary ability to extract performance even when the car isn't clearly the fastest. That's why his comments after practice have generated so much debate. It's not just a critique of the regulations or a reflection on the car's feel. It's also a sign that Verstappen himself knows this start to the season could be more complicated than usual. In short, Max Verstappen's words after the first practice session of the Australian Grand Prix shouldn't be interpreted as a mere momentary reaction to a Friday session. His comments reflect something much deeper. On the one hand, a clear criticism of the new technical regulations that force drivers to constantly rely on energy management. On the other hand, a sign that even a team as dominant as Red Bull is going through a phase of adaptation in this new era of Formula One. Therefore, the true meaning of this start to the season is still being written. What we've seen in practice in Australia, Maybe just the first chapter of a season far more unpredictable than many imagined. And if anything is clear after listening to Verstappen, it's that this new era of Formula One will not only test the team's engineering, but also the driver's ability to adapt to a completely different way of racing. The question is unavoidable. Are we simply witnessing a difficult start for Red Bull within a new project? Or have Ferrari and Mercedes truly taken a step forward in this new technical era of Formula One? The interesting thing is that these kinds of regulatory changes often completely redefine the competitive landscape during the first few months. Teams that initially seem to have a head start can lose ground as their rivals begin to better understand the car, while others that start with doubts can discover hidden performance as they analyze data and develop their technical package. I want to read your opinion. Do you think Verstappen will return to dominance once Red Bull fully understands the car, or are we entering a much more open season than many expected? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more analysis like this.